Okay, you ready?
Action.
Action. So I'm gonna go from the bottom up because it gets really much more interesting on the top. So the bottom, above the sacrum, of course, you have 5 lumbar vertebrae, and you count them down 1 to 5. So this is a typical lumbar vertebra: lateral view, anterior view, and posterior view. Okay? So generally this has the thickest vertebral body. Sometimes it's called the centrum. It's the whole thing. Simplest thing. It only has one hole, which is called the vertebral canal. Now if you look at these 2 side processes, they're called the transverse processes. And pretty much all the other vertebrae except for one have transverse processes. This posterior process is the one you can feel on your back, and that is the spinous process. Now if you look at the vertebral canal, it's kind of like heart-shaped, right? So lumbar has generally a more heart-shaped vertebral canal, superior view. So body, transverse processes, and this is the spinous process. Now this is going to articulate inferior with the sacrum, so you have your inferior articulating processes, and you also have superior articulating processes. So if you look at this view, the posterior view, it looks like a moose, right? It looks like a moose, right? Where you look at the thoracic posterior, it looks more like a giraffe, right? So it has the same parts. It has a body or centrum. It has transverse processes, vertebral canal, but notice the vertebral canal is more circular. And this also has your superior articulating facets and inferior articulating facets. And if you notice, the spinous process is more descending inferiorly, you see? And they kind of overlap each other. So again, thoracic from the back has a downgoing spinous process, so it looks more like a giraffe or an elephant. And this looks more like a moose, right? Sometimes they say this looks like a giraffe. What do you think? So this is more giraffe, this is more elephant, or this is more moose, and this is more elephant, huh? Yeah, so this is my last word on this. This is your giraffe, this is your elephant. That makes the most sense to me, okay? But don't forget the transverse processes, and I'm not gonna ask you about the moose and the giraffe, but notice that the spinous process goes inferior. This one is more vertical. Lumbar, thoracic, more inferior. Now cervical, a typical cervical, which is C3, and by the way, there's 12 thoracic counting down, and each thoracic vertebrae has a rib. There's 12 thoracic vertebrae, there's 12 pairs of ribs that come off the thoracic vertebrae. So this is a typical cervical vertebrae, which there's 7 cervical vertebrae, starting with C1, atlas, C2, axis, and then from 3 to 7 basically look like this. So note, this is the only vertebrae, and you can't really see because this is covering it up. See it from this is the inferior view. There's 3 holes, 1 vertebral foramen and 2 transverse foramen. So that's, even though these are small transverse processes, they have a foramen, and this houses the vertebral artery. So the other vertebrae only have 1 hole, thoracic, lumbar, moose, thoracic, elephant, okay? So that's the inferior view, and you can see the inferior articulating facets. Now this is superior view, superior articulating facets, and notice the spinous process of the cervical vertebrae are what's called bifid. They look like 2 fins. This one's kind of broken off, but if you look in your textbook or your book, lab manual, you can see that these are bifid. So the cervical should be apparent to you. You'll see it on the practical. You'll see there's 3 holes, 2 transverse foramen, 1 vertebral foramen, bifid spinous process. So 3 holes. The other 2 do not have that. Now this is C1 and C2. So C1 sits on top of C2 like this. And remember those occipital condyles, those cute little slippers right here? They're going to sit on C1. And I have it backwards, sorry. This is the way it goes. So that would sit right on there, just like that. And the vertebral column protects the spinal cord. That's why they call this the vertebral canal. So C1 is irregular. It does not have a spinous process. It has transverse processes with transverse foramen, but it just has what's called a posterior tubercle, not a spinous process. Like C2, and this is called axis, this has a bifid spinous process. Superior articulating facets that are going to articulate with the occipital condyles of the occipital bone. This is the anterior tubercle. So it's no other vertebra looks like this. And it sits right here on the axis. So C1 is called atlas, no spinous process. C2 is called axis. So if you notice this anterior superior process called the odontoid process, also known as the dens, D-E-N-S. And here's your superior articulating facets, or processes. I like to call them facets. That's going to articulate with the inferior articulating facets of atlas. So atlas, C1, axis, C2. C2 axis has the dens. And everything else is pretty similar to the other cervical vertebrae. Note 3 holes, 2 transverse foramen housing the vertebral canal. Housing the vertebral artery, and the vertebral canal housing the top of the spinal cord. And that's it.